Hello everyone, my name is Amisha. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and it is my privilege to serve as the Executive Director for UConn Global Health Spaces on campus. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you again to the second day of our fourth annual Global Health Symposium, Decolonizing Global Health. All of this would not be possible again without the help of our generous sponsors and partners. I would like to thank UConn Global Affairs, the Human Rights Institute, Dodd Impact, the Research Program in Global Health and Human Rights, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the UConn Sociology Department, the UConn Anthropology Department, and the UConn Individualized and Interdisciplinary Studies Program. I'd also like to thank the countless student organizations and departments, both here at UConn and across the country, that have shared this event with their students. And of course, a huge thank you to my friends in UConn Global Health Spaces on campus, who have worked tirelessly over the last few months to make this weekend's programming a reality. As we discuss decolonization this weekend, we must remember that this is not a conversation about just other countries and areas around the world. Rather, the impacts and long-lasting effects of colonialism can be found here in the United States, with our history of colonizing Native American and Indigenous lands. Thus, before we start our event today, we would like to begin by acknowledging the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagussit, Lenape, and Nipmuc peoples whose traditional lands we currently stand on. We recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their land. It is also worth noting that the town of Mansfield, and by extension, the University of Connecticut's existence and legacy, would not be possible without the labor of enslaved Black people. We acknowledge, respect, and honor those whose forced labor allows us to work, live, and learn in this space. We hope that you walk away from this weekend knowing that you have the ability to have a huge impact on the field of global health, and that every one of you has a critical role in breaking down barriers and colonial legacies and building a healthier, more connected world. By choosing to be here today, you have already taken your first step towards working for a more equitable world, one where every individual has access to quality and affordable healthcare, regardless of their background, beliefs, or circumstances. UConn Global Health Spaces on Campus proudly presents our fourth annual Global Health Symposium, Decolonizing Global Health. Before we get started, so the structure of this keynote session, Dr. Kalinowski, our keynote speaker, will be speaking for a few minutes regarding her presentation, and then we will move into a question and answer session. For this, you can either raise your hand and our host will unmute you so that you can verbally voice your question, or you can send a question via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Another note, live transcript and closed captioning is also available, so feel free to use that if needed. And so on that note, I would like to welcome and introduce our second keynote speaker for our symposium this weekend. Dr. Jolaade Kalinowski is a behavioral cardiovascular researcher. Her research pertains to the role of chronic stress in cardiovascular disease, risk reduction in Black women, and how stressors may contribute to health disparities. Jolaade has had a somewhat circuitous route to research, but has always been committed to social justice issues. She's a first-generation American raised outside of Washington, D.C., with immigrant parents from West Africa. Jolaade pursued the interdisciplinary major at American University in communications, legal institutions, economics, and government. Following college, she obtained a master's in international affairs from Georgetown University, discovering public health research and realizing that she could pursue a research career that would allow her to study the very issues that led to her interest in social justice. Jolaade then pursued further education at Columbia University, Teachers College, to study health and behavior. As a student, she also worked at the New York City Department of Health, NYC-DOH, one of the largest health municipalities in the world, helping to evaluate behavioral health interventions and programs under the umbrella of health promotion and disease prevention. As a postdoctoral fellow at the NYU School of Medicine, Jolaade received extensive training in behavioral health and cardiovascular epidemiology. She recognized the cardiovascular disease disparities facing Black women and felt compelled to explore this area further. In her spare time, Jolaade loves activism, traveling, cooking, home decor, and do-it-yourself or DIY home projects. And so with that note, I would like to ask everyone to share a warm welcome for Dr. Kalinowski.
Thank you for such a comprehensive introduction. I appreciate that greatly. So I am Jolaade Kalinowski, as Amisha has said, and I am an assistant professor at UConn in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences. And so the crux of my work really kind of gets at the historical nuances of why we see these disparities. And so with that, really want to encourage a very open, dynamic conversation. So I do have some slides to present, but I really want to encourage folks to to ask questions. Not just about the research I'm presenting, but anything about my path. I know there are many students here who may have similar interests in research or public health or medicine or even other disciplines. So I am happy to, answer questions about my specific journey and just encourage everyone to really ask away. I do ask that we hold questions until the end and look forward to a very, very dynamic conversation. Okay. So a little bit about me is I think Amisha touched on some of these points. I I started off very much interested in social justice and public policy issues and hadn't really found public health until really my master's program at Georgetown, where I did some research on humanitarian interventions in Somalia. And that really kind of led me to be very fascinated with health and its implications on humanity and injustice. And so that really led me to Columbia, where I ultimately pursued another master's degree and doctoral degree. And following that, went to the NYU School of Medicine for a postdoctoral fellowship in behavioral cardiovascular medicine for 3 years. And a very key piece to this postdoc was it was for underrepresented minorities in medicine. And so this program is funded by the National Institutes of Health to really encourage and facilitate underrepresented minorities into research. And so there are recognized disparities not only in different communities, but also in the field of medicine and research. And so, as such, there are a lot of opportunities and programs geared to resolving these issues. And so, I would also be happy to answer questions about that as well. It obviously was an integral aspect of my training and really sort of the foundation from which I was able to really kind of launch my trajectory in terms of research. And so, following that training, I joined UConn as a tenure track faculty in 2020. So, just broadly speaking, my research interests pertain to advancing the understanding of these complex interactions between psychosocial, behavioral, and community factors that could be contributing to disparities in cardiovascular disease, specifically and particularly in Black women. And then, secondarily, to develop, test, and implement interventions to mitigate these adverse health effects that we do see. So, just to give a brief overview, there are longstanding CVD disparities affecting Black women. As you can see on the left, there are disproportionate levels of hypertension in non Hispanic Black adults. The highest across any racial and ethnic group or all racial and ethnic groups. And then you can also see some key health facts here pertaining to heart disease in African American women. There are disproportionate levels of high blood pressure. There are disparities in physical activity guideline achievements. There are also some increased levels of typical sort of comorbidities or risk factors that we see that are high risk factors for cardiovascular disease, such as obesity. Um, and so, and these risk factors that I'm talking about, they're largely modifiable sort of behavioral risk factors that can be intervened on. It's not necessarily to say that inherently these risks are um, specific to Black women. It's more so that there's a long-standing historical context that we have to understand as to why these factors may be um, leading to these disparities, which goes to the crux of the core of this presentation and understanding the historical implications such as colonialization, slavery, Jim Crow, persistent racial discrimination, gender discrimination, all of these historical contexts that are really sort of perpetuating these disparities further. So, a couple of years ago, I wrote a piece in circulation about why young Black women are continually at high risk for cardiovascular disease, and yet uh, receive very little counseling and risk conversations with providers about their risk. So, heart disease is a leading cause of death in um, women in the United States, and you know, there are disproportionate levels of morbidity and mortality facing Black women, and Black women tend to have cardiovascular disease much earlier and really fare much worse in comparison to white women. And despite these revelations and these essentially kind of known facts, there are still very few solutions that we have really developed to address these issues, as well as particularly in the case of young Black women, very few longitudinal cohorts, epidemiological studies that are addressing this. And it's particularly important that we do look at young Black women if we know that these risk factors are largely modifiable, then these younger ages present us with opportunities to intervene and to perhaps lower ultimate risk for developing cardiovascular disease, or at least improving outcomes in those who do. So, a question I'm often asked is, well, why Black women? That answer is obvious to me, but I realize that it may not necessarily be obvious to others, and it may be important to really just unpack why. So, there's this double jeopardy of gender and race related stress that's particularly salient to Black women. Across both uh, cross genders, Black women report greater exposure to stressful events and circumstances and higher stress levels overall. And there is this sort of toxic combination of both race and gender related stressors that is really unique to Black women in particular. And these sort of gender racially motivated, sometimes minor daily hassles, otherwise known as microaggressions, represent a unique form of chronic stress over time that may contribute to these health disparities that we see in cardiovascular disease. And so, an example that I just also like to cite is, Black women have reported frequent gendered racial microaggressions found to have poor health related quality of life. And this was mediated by higher levels of maladaptive coping. And maladaptive coping is basically ways that people decide to kind of cope with things that they're facing that may not have the best health effects or may have other consequences. So, an example of that could be smoking, or it could be drinking, it could be substance use. These would be possible examples of maladaptive coping. So, an example that I want to get into of maladaptive coping that is particularly salient in the Black community is this notion of superwoman schema. And it is most certainly rooted in the historical context by which Africans were brought to this country. And it essentially posits that there is an obligation to maintain strength, to suppress emotions, and resist vulnerability, to prioritize sort of making it, to prioritize survival, to prioritize strength. And this is very much, a result of that sort of fight or flight response that, we typically see in the short term, but in this community has really sort of yet to leave. And so this sort of sociological or behavioral theory really has led to a lot of poor coping mechanisms that may have in turn or in turn leading to me that are in turn leading to health disparities and increased risk for things such as hypertension, which we know are very correlated with levels of stress. And so, again, this is something that should not really be a surprise given um, the trauma and the historical context that we know to be true. So, I want to now kind of change gears a little bit and just talk about meditation interventions, stress management, and in the context of Black women. So, meditation is not new and is a promising non pharmacological, sort of non medication approach to reducing blood pressure and even possibly CBD. And so, you can see here, this is a statement from the American Heart Association adding credence to this potential intervention. And despite the numerous empirical studies that have been recently done indicating that mindfulness or meditation based interventions may be improving health, both physical and mental health outcomes. Very little research has actually been done in diverse populations, and there really hasn't been a whole lot of research on um, reducing the burden of traditional in-person delivery of mindfulness interventions and meditation based interventions, and so that is something that I am very keen on exploring as a researcher. So as part of my postdoc, I worked on adapting a program for adapting the mindfulness to a telephone based program in a multi-center women of multi-center trial of women with heart disease. And through that, I became very much interested in exploring how this may be effective for Black women who have risk for CVD, but not necessarily established heart disease. And so given what we know about mobile phone use in Black women, the flexibility of self guided programs via apps, I felt that AMT's app delivered mindfulness training programs could be a possible promising approach for reducing stress in Black women. And much to really my surprise, there were no established studies that looked at just this. So I proposed that. And so, you know, it is, also the fact that there is so little empirical research in this area is demonstrative of how much work we have to do in this area and how really underserved this particular community is. And so that said, I proposed a study that really had two aims. One is just to compare the feasibility and the acceptability of the telephone program that I initially mentioned that I worked on versus the app in Black women with elevated blood pressure. And then the second aim was just to compare these effects. Is it that the telephone group had lower rates of hypertension compared to the app program? Like, what were these comparative effects? So this project is still ongoing, but it essentially has three main arms. So again, the telephone program, app-delivered mindfulness training, and usual care. And just to elaborate a little bit more, usual care is sort of the standard of care currently, which is, if you went into your doctor's office, they said that you had elevated blood pressure. Typically, you might be given some brochures, but there's sort of no intervention that might be done if you had elevated blood pressure. And just to provide this service or opportunity to everyone, the individuals in usual care, while they wouldn't receive any of these interventions during the program, they had an opportunity or will have an opportunity to receive them following the conclusion of the program. And so I'm just kind of going to give a brief overview of the study measures that we'll be looking at: blood pressure and anthropometrics, so height, waist, weight, electronic health record review, so looking at different medications if they may be taking, other risk factors for CVD, such as diabetes, high cholesterol, smoking. And then also some self report questionnaires looking at acculturation, for example. Are there different factors at play for foreign born Black women versus Black women born in the US? What about other psychosocial factors such as depression, stress, resilience? And so these are sort of different questionnaires that we're also looking at and considering. And so, kind of moving on to another piece of my research, I want to just briefly talk about the Jackson Heart um, Study Hypertension Working Group, which I'm a part of. So, the Jackson Heart Study is a prospective cohort study of African Americans in the Jackson, Mississippi metropolitan area, sort of colloquially known as the stroke belt of the United States. Um, the purpose of this sort of mega cohort study is to investigate the causes of CVD in African Americans. And it's very much a longitudinal study, having started in 2000. So now almost 21 years of data. And so, as you can imagine, this is a very rich data set that allows for a lot of unique data to answer some very, very key important questions. And so I just kind of want to point out a couple of papers that um, we have completed using the Jackson Heart Study data. One study that we examined, where we examined chronic stress and hypertension, revealed that chronic stress did indeed increase the risk of hypertension in Black Americans. And across all models, we were able to kind of notice this effect of stress and increased risk for hypertension. So, a few other Jackson Heart projects that I'm working on include some uh, manuscripts looking at diabetes, prediabetes, and CVD, hypertension awareness. And whether or not, so that's to say, whether or not someone's diagnosed with hypertension, does that possibly lead to higher levels of distress? Just the mere labeling of hypertension, does that lead to distress? And then also stress, depression, and life simple 7, which is American Heart Association's kind of recommended 7 sort of benchmarks that individuals should be pursuing to achieve ideal cardiovascular health, whether or not what that looks like in the context of African Americans. And then I'm also looking at the effects of concurrent high stress and depression on incident CVD in Black Americans. So, just kind of my future direction, I'm really just, again, interested in also what other stress management approaches could be acceptable and feasible. Can stress improve adoption of healthy lifestyle behaviors to reduce CVD risk in Black women? Can the Superwoman schema help identify Black women who may benefit most from stress reduction interventions? And then also looking at how this may extend to other disease states such as type 2 diabetes or obesity. And then, what other vulnerable populations experiencing CVD disparities could also benefit from stress reduction tools? So that said, I am kind of all done with my sort of presentation piece and would like to kind of turn it back to really the audience to really answer any questions that you have about my presentation, about my particular journey, career questions, really kind of anything. Nothing is sort of off limits. So that said, I would like to thank you all for listening and I appreciate your time.
Okay, that was really great, Dr. Kalinowski. There are a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so I can start reading them off if that is good.
Okay. I'm trying to go back to, okay, so that way I can see.
Okay,
Great.
perfect. One second.
So I don't see the questions, but if you can just kind of tell me what they are, then
Yes, I will do that.
okay.
Adding this spotlight. Okay, so the first question is would helping reduce CVD and the issue of chronic stress be a long-term goal or something that can be helped in a shorter period of time? Basically, how can we create long-lasting change so we can see the issue of chronic stress among Black women go down on a national and progressive scale?
This is a very important question and something that I've really been asking myself as a researcher is typically in my research, I've been involved in individual level change, individual level behavior change. And with the premise that we, at this time, these we can't change the exposure to these historical events. We can't necessarily change or control whether or not someone is exposed to discrimination. However, we can potentially try to intervene at the individual level in terms of how we may react to such events and how we can handle that to mitigate the effects. But that isn't necessarily enough, and nor should it be the burden of someone who is being discriminated against to solely kind of take on that responsibility. Like for long lasting change, we need to look at institutions and the context and the environment that we live in and address those from that perspective too. So that is involves a lot more policy and sort of like macro level interventions that I'm really looking at keenly and hardly or hard in a way that it's just it's so complex and so part of this country and really around the world these sort of discriminatory um, and social injustices. So I'm really thinking hard about that and figuring out how do we kind of deal with this from a macro societal perspective because it's simply um, wrong to simply say only at the individual level like you'll keep dealing with discrimination but we'll just give you the tools to manage it. Why not look at how we end discrimination, how we promote equity and deal with it from that perspective so that these things don't have to persist.
Thank you. So the next question is, do you think promoting slash encouraging more minorities to join the health industry will help create more change and recognition for the fact that CBD is more commonly seen in Black women and other minorities?
Absolutely. So, just think, if I wasn't here to give this presentation to you today, I mean, maybe, I mean, I'm not obviously the only one doing this research, but you know, my having a membership in this community, my genuine interest in eradicating these issues because I've seen it firsthand in my own family definitely contributes to um, my persistence in this arena. And I think that that can be said for so many underserved and underrepresented minority communities. And so it's absolutely imperative to have underrepresented minorities joining this research and doing so as soon as possible. Even thinking about the cultural context for which we understand certain things. For example, you know, food and diet. Understanding the nuances and being culturally competent and understanding what unique foods like are important to a community, why it's not necessarily that eating like a chicken breast, rice, and a vegetable is going to be acceptable and feasible for an individual. Why is it that their foods and cultural what they are used to is no longer healthy? That's not necessarily the case, and really just it perpetuates bias all around. So again, understanding these cultural nuances and having your experience from your underserved community, I think, contributes greatly. And I would therefore encourage everyone who can or is interested to get into it.
Yeah, so what are some ways that we can educate the entire population of such issues that are caused by colonialism and colonization on minorities? Should this issue be a more prominent part of our education, especially for the public health majors at our universities?
Absolutely. So I think this probably there's a long-winded answer for this, but the short version is, you know, at least I can speak from my experience and my experience, which is that, in K through 12, I never really learned a lot about any of this. And was only really when I went to college, and even then, so much bias about what was actually taught. And really just kind of does a disservice to us all. And so we don't think about, even just thinking about, for example, we don't think about when we learn about history, at least when I learned about history in school, we learned that there was slavery. We did not learn that, there are these long lasting effects of slavery on these communities. We don't learn about the health disparities that are persistently plaguing Native communities and how they're consistently and perpetually fighting for their lives. Like, we don't talk about the pipeline. We don't talk about all of these injustices that are just abysmal, and a national embarrassment. We don't talk about them. And so it therefore leaves, I think it encourages gaslighting and just the idea that, oh, like maybe, like we're not learning about it. Like maybe it's in my own head. Well, no, it's just um, the perpetuation of the trauma and the bias. It's not at all indicative of what the actual history tells us. And so, even just visiting the African American Museum in DC a couple of years ago when it first came out, and understanding, even as a Black woman who lives in America, who was born in America, my experience is so much different than my brothers and sisters who are African American, whose parents or whose slavery has impacted many generations before them. And so to some extent, I guess, given the context that we are in, it does take some self initiation to really kind of find these things out and learn. But I think that we as a country really need to have these very earnest, honest conversations in a genuine fashion. And I am hopeful, but I understand how much work is ahead of us. For example, if you just read the news headlines from the last few days, you'll probably see something along the lines of, Blacks unwilling to get COVID vaccine or something like that. And it's like, well, have we talked about Henrietta Lacks and the continued injustices that we see there? Tuskegee, the syphilis trial, you know, longstanding pharma injustices all over the world, in the human subjects that they've abused. So it's it's very deep and it's very, very heavy. And I think, once you start learning, it's kind of it's a self-discovery that sort of you can't forget, you can't unlearn what you've learned. And so I think that that's what I would encourage, is just to really get out there and have that self-initiation to really kind of figure it out. And then once we have that, then we can be really armed with information and, you know, use it to advance progress.
Yes, I think this theme of education and just making sure that that information is out there has been something that has been brought up in every single session that we've had this weekend. So this just goes to show the importance of all of that.
Mhm.
Another question is, how can the government help change this disparity? What policy changes are needed, I guess, on the behalf of the government?
Yeah, so I think that there's multiple layers here. For example, we know, I'll just use the example of childcare now, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic. There's this pressure to want to get back to work and, open the economy again. Well, we know that parenting stress and caregiving stress, particularly in the context of African Americans, is a big stressor. And, the cost of childcare is exorbitant. And so, if it becomes a question like, how can that, like, we can obviously see how that can, in and of itself, lead to certain disparities, like the childcare that you get, early childhood education, diet and physical activity, if you're stretched financially and physically. um, so on that level, then obviously even just looking at policies regarding food and nutrition, and looking at, um, I think we've all, or maybe, probably some of you have seen driving through a certain neighborhood and you see there's Popeyes and other fast food on every corner, where as you're driving in, you know, a more affluent area, and you see that there's Whole Foods and Trader Joe's on every block. So looking at it from that perspective, looking at, it from the perspective of financial wellness as well. So we see that, discrimination and inequities isn't just a health issue, but it's also a financial issue. So disproportionate levels of student loans, disproportionate levels of debt, disproportionate levels of, renting compared to home ownership, all of these things that we know, impact generational wealth and well-being, are not equal. And so it really, if you think about it, it's it's sort of every facet of our lives. Education. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on a policy level. It can be daunting to think about, certainly, but those are the like sort of examples of policy areas that I think we need to be looking at.
Yeah, definitely important to look at just intersectionality and
Mhm.
as well as just the social determinants of health. I guess that's the overall theme for a lot of our symposiums. But another question, I'm trying to read through them. What would you say is the hardest part of studying mental health and stress?
I think for me, what has been very challenging at times is knowing and understanding that stress is a dynamic process, and that, even just, you know, the news of hearing something at 2 p.m. may change how you feel at 5 p.m. And so understanding and honoring that it is a dynamic process, and that, that it can change over the course of years, hours, days. And so that sometimes makes it very challenging. Another area is that we don't have enough tools, that are sort of culturally competent across many different communities to really even measure stress. So a lot of the tools that we currently have are just not really culturally sensitive or appropriate. So an example of that might be just, how many days of the week have you been feeling blue? Like, what does that mean for someone who that doesn't make sense to? Like, not all cultures or communities represent or associate feeling blue with actually feeling down. And so that's an example of cultural incompetence, in my opinion, and what I have continued to see in research, and a reason why, my research interest is, you know, also looking at the measurements and the tools that we're even using.
So that I think is kind of related to our next question, which is what advice do you have for medical and pharmaceutical research teams to incorporate more underrepresented groups in their clinical trials so that their findings represent the entire population and not just a small subset?
Mhm. Well, a key piece to that is community-based participatory research. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with that term, but it's the idea of um, meaningfully, because I use that word very kind of like key, meaningfully engaging communities um, for their input from the onset. So you're developing clinical trial. Well, why don't you invite a panel of community members to provide their insight as to whether or not they think things are ethical, as to whether or not things are appropriate. You know, I went to a training a few years ago on qualitative research in at Penn, and one of the speakers, this really resonated with me. One of the speakers talked to us about how in South Philly, residents were inundated or are inundated with Penn researchers who are just like, we want to research you, we want to look at you, we want to like look in on you and like tell you what we want to study. How inappropriate is that? And how and then do the research and never get back to them about, oh well, what can you, like, this is what we found, like this is how you can improve these outcomes, this is a path forward. And so thinking about it in ethically, from the very very beginning, from the onset, not just we've designed this protocol and now just need your buy-in because it looks really bad if we don't, but from a genuine perspective of we want to include you. And part of that means also having diverse research teams and being inclusive from even just that perspective. I mean, if we don't even have that, why are we to believe that diversity and inclusion really even matters to you? Like if we don't have representation. Um, so so yeah, that would be that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think it is really important to have both representation among I guess, the subject pool, or the people the research subjects, but also the people who are running the research, because I think that not having that just continues to perpetuate that power imbalance between the people
Mhm.
who are doing the research and those who are
Exactly.
not. So, another question: what challenges have you experienced as a woman in your field of work, and how have you overcome this?
Sure. So I've experienced numerous challenges as a woman and as a Black woman, and then also really as a first generation student, really kind of intersectionality at its finest. And I think there have been a couple things. So I actually had children in my postdoc. I had twins in my postdoc, and that presented a unique set of challenges that I had really kind of probably been somewhat unprepared for to manage in terms of the juggling. And unfortunately, there's still underrepresentation of women in science. And I personally had, luckily, a couple of really great mentors and strong examples of women who were in a similar positions or who had been. But it became very clear to me that even amongst the women who I sort of from the outside looking in seem to have it all or be amazingly juggling everything, were very honest with me and explaining and describing some of the challenges that they experienced that I ultimately did myself. And so I think that this is an ongoing issue, particularly in regards to affordable, safe, reliable childcare. That seems to be an issue that disproportionately affects women. I've also faced um, issues and challenges with people sort of undervaluing my work, or sort of not realizing the importance of the population that I'm interested in um, exploring, and whether that's said in very polite terms or not. I've experienced both. So really standing strong, and being very strong in my convictions. And I think also just being honest with myself, in order to basically say, at times, this might be a great opportunity, but I can see a lot of roadblocks here that is just not going to be conducive to my well-being or my development. And so I'm going to take a pause on that, even if from the outside looking in, this might be a great line for my CV. But so prioritizing things like that, places that will honor my work, that will value my work, that will see the contributions that I have to make, not places where the burden will be on me to prove that. Um, and just very much sometimes kind of faking it till you make it, because it is definitely sometimes scary to take those positions, but just knowing that, at least in my experience, like forcing these things never really works out either, right? So it's like, taking a step back to really at least know that you'll have the peace of mind and the freedom from a potentially toxic situation, then being like, oh, well, this is like an amazing opportunity and I can deal with that. Like, probably not. And so from the onset and the outset, being clear about who you are, what your research interests are. For me, they're very much tied into who I am as a person. So it is a very personal and professional kind of marriage, if you will. So yeah, if you kind of don't accept one part of me, then like it won't work. So I do think, as a woman, I faced these issues as a Black person. um, I think not so much kind of overt, but maybe kind of, whether it's people not really thinking that I'm the postdoc, or maybe that maybe I'm like the administrator or something like that. Like, definitely sort of microaggressions, like that have happened to me. But again, I think being strong and steadfast in your beliefs. And then also, this is very key, having very strong mentorship. So I was still a little bit, again, I think becoming a researcher and pursuing higher education is great, obviously, for many reasons. But I think the most important thing that it has given me is independence and autonomy. And so it has given me the position to say, well, I don't want to do that. And here's why. And to have a seat at the table and to be able to be steadfast and strong in my convictions. And so I think for me, that has been like the biggest revelation of this entire journey. And then having mentors who really bring the best out of you and who help to encourage you. So one of my mentors, early on, really said, because I had received some feedback that, I was being too specific about the populations I was interested in, and which is really like coded language for something else. And that really made me question a lot of things. And this particular mentor mentioned the fact that you are so, compelled to do this work. The fact that you have these personal experiences that you cite that has impacted, um, how you view this work. You now almost in a sense have this moral obligation to see it through and to really push forward. And so someone who can also like give you that talk when you need it, but also like say, okay, maybe take a break when you do need it too. So I think just choosing the right mentors, and choosing the right village, and understanding who to go to for what and when, is important.
Yes, for sure. Another question. This is, I think, a bio question.
Mhm.
Have you ever thought to look at genetic association in essential hypertension, um, in with genes involved in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, for examples in young Black women with early on hypertension?
So, no, I have not, but I've looked at other um, genetic processes such as DNA methylation and stress, and how methylation of certain um, hypertension related genes may change depending on exposure level to stress. And that's something that I've looked at. But again, this is an example of kind of how much work there is to be done. And so if that's something that interests you, I would implore you to really go for it and to look at it. I mean, my work primarily looks at like the behavioral aspect of things, but I also realize that, we don't really work kind of compartmentalized. Like we have to also look at how the biological stuff is also impacting the behavioral stuff, and so the environmental piece. So, yes, I think that it's a fantastic question, and I would implore you to really look at it.
So another question that someone had was, how can we make the change so that studying Black women's health is made easier by lessening the schema and obligation to appear strong? Can we help make that change as undergraduate students, and in what ways?
Hmm, that's a great question. So I think that in our own daily lives, kind of checking ourselves and self-regulating ourselves to be aware of our biases. So it's not to say like we all won't or shouldn't have biases. It's just whether or not we kind of let that lead the way in terms of our behavior. And so I would say, even just in simple interactions with people, just kind of checking yourself in that way. I think that as undergraduates or students in general, taking part of clubs and joining organizations and groups to show solidarity and to support and provide allyship are just very tangible ways to be able to do that. But I think probably almost more impactfully is just really in our sort of daily interactions with folks, and really allowing, there's nothing like being around someone where you kind of know that you're in a safe space with this person, that you can talk about things that and it doesn't necessarily mean that we all come from similar backgrounds. Like, you could be talking to someone who has had an exorbitant amount of privilege, and um, you know they can still be a fantastic ally and support. So I think that that's a very tangible way to do that.
Okay, great. So there are two more questions. I'll read them out both together, and if you would like to answer them
Okay.
both together, I think that's great, just in the interest of time. So one is, what are some important examples of work that you've seen being done in fields beyond clinical healthcare, either through research or direct practice, to address disparities of CVD and stress among Black women and those issues' historical roots? As well as, is there a country or nation in the world where we don't see these large health disparities between people of different genders and races? And if so, what strategies do they have that will help us to close the gap on these disparities?
So I'll answer the first question first. Yes, there are amazing examples of this, especially now, particularly in the media space and technology space. There have been so many startups that are looking at, um, you know, particularly in the realm of African American women or Black women, looking at uh, like trauma informed counseling, looking at mindfulness apps that are being led or um, that have Black facilitators. There, so there's a lot of entrepreneurship happening right now with people who know these issues firsthand and who are committed to solving them. And I think that that's very exciting to see, and something that I'm very hopeful for, not just in particularly in this community of Black women, but just in many underserved communities who who could really use these resources. So that those are just kind of some general examples. Um, and the name is escaping me, but even for one particular app that kind of addresses, for example, directly, um, discrimination and different things that maybe another commercially available resource may not. So just kind of using those historical and contextual nuances to provide a very targeted service. And then regarding the last question, it's very this question is complex because um, even, for example, I actually a few years ago attended a talk by a physician in Nigeria who was looking at cardiovascular disease disparities. And it will be really hard to say that the disparities that they see there aren't somewhat related to the aftermath of colonialism because they're so far, so deeply entrenched. For example, colorism is a great example of that, where that was really exacerbated and perpetuated by foreign influence, where and it's not just in West, many other communities where colorism is indeed a very big driver of inequity and disparities. Classism, which sometimes is inherently also tied into colorism, and so we do see these disparities in other parts of the world that don't necessarily have the racial and ethnic breakdown of groups that we have, but still have ethnic um, disparities, like across tribal. So, all that to say, seemingly around the world, there are inequities and disparities everywhere, particularly in the context of colonialism. It is very blatant and evident of how colonialism has really impacted um, places far beyond um, what anyone may have imagined, and so it continues to be an ongoing problem.
So that was our last question. So thank you so much, Dr. Kalinowski. This talk was very informative and really did connect to our theme of decolonizing global health and just seeing how these colonial legacies are also present in the United States and even in settings that we wouldn't typically think of them in, especially in like the physical manifestation of some of these histories. So yeah, thank you again so much for your
Thank
time.
you all. And then I'll put my email in the, well, I'm not sure if I can, okay, let's see. If I can put my email in the chat box. Or maybe you can, because it looks like I don't have access to that. But you can share my email with anyone who wants to follow up with me individually about any questions or who's interested in any aspect of my research or anything I presented today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
for our attendees, if you're here for extra credit or like class credit, there's a form in the chat, as well as for our raffle prizes. There's also another form in the chat. So please do make sure to fill those out if you wish to. But other than that, I think we're good. Thank you all again for coming.
Thank you.
And I encourage all of you to also attend our session tomorrow, where we'll be doing like a networking brainstorming activity and trying to understand where our role really, where we can fit into this fight for health justice. So definitely feel free to come tomorrow. It's at 10 a.m. On Zoom. So looking forward to seeing everyone there.
Best of luck to you all. Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me.